Well, we're still gathering everybody together, but thanks everybody for joining. We have, I was just saying to Jamie and David that we have over 30 people registered, which is good to see. And I'll be admitting people here in the background. I have a few brief BFI, Buckminster Fuller Institute announcements. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. If you don't mind muting your mic to troubleshoot that. And let me just bring up my notes here. All right, so we are recording. As you probably saw the Zoom notification, my name is Felicia. For those of you who have not met me yet, I'm the Chief of Staff here at BFI. And I've only been with BFI since October of last year, so just a year now. You all probably know more about Buckminster Fuller himself than I do, so I'm very happy to be participating in this event. If you are a member, you've probably heard from me. We've recently switched our membership platform. And so if you have not signed up on our new website, which is a WordPress website, the old one was Drupal, then you are not a current member. I will put my email in the chat box so that you can send me any questions you have about your membership. Big announcement is TrimTab Space Camp has begun. Climate stabilization is the focus of this space camp. It officially started yesterday, but you can still join using the link in the chat, which I will put here. And also I wanted to mention, in case you don't know, that if you're a Dymaxion member, donating $20 a month to BFI, then you receive 50% off the $199 Space Camp course price. And then if you're Synergy or Geodesic, it goes up from there. And we're working on planning more member events. And as I said, you can send me a note if you have any questions about the status of your membership. Before I turn it over to David and Jamie, I just wanted to check with Faith because I see you have joined us. Faith, did you want to say anything about Space Camp or anything else?
Just to repeat that there's still an opportunity to join us for Space Camp. We are hosting our first session on October 18th with Judith Schwartz and Ryan Allard, and we look forward to having you all there. And I just wanted to say a special thank you to Jaime Snyder and David McConville for having you both here. This is an exciting conversation, and we look forward to spending more time. And I also heard that we don't need to stop at 4. So for those of you that are still able to stay on, we can stay on for a little while after, just chat.
Super. Great. So those are our announcements. We don't need to tell you where the restrooms are. So I'm going to turn it over to you, David and Jamie.
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you, Faith. And I can attest, Judy Schwartz, anyway, is one of the most amazing planetologists I know of today. She's written extraordinary books on water and ruminants and all kinds of things that I highly encourage anybody to check out the Space Camp for that very reason. Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Jamie. Really glad we could have this conversation. We've got some rather knowledgeable people on the call. And I know that we'd planned on sort of, speaking of ruminating on our own experiences reading this book, The Sense of Significance. As many of you well know, Jaime Snyder was the long-term president of BFI. He's Bucky's grandson and was his confidant for many years, traveling around, and has been running the Estate of Buckminster Fuller for a number of years. And we're here because, amongst other reasons, they're republishing The Sense of Significance, which was, I think, just launched on Apple ebook store this week. And the hard copy is coming out. So it's a very exciting time. And I know this book itself is the favorite of some folks that are, deeply attuned to the life of Fuller because it's unique, I think, in terms of some of the insights that it gives about his personal influences and some things that oftentimes aren't necessarily well understood, where the genesis of a lot of ideas were. And so today we just really wanted to explore some of the central themes of the book, to kind of talk about some of the key stories that are in there. So, I mean, spoiler alert, we'll probably talk about some things if you haven't had a chance to read it, but we also would love to engage some of you with questions and thoughts and ideas around some of these core themes, because I think it's a rare occasion actually to be able to talk to Jaime, and I mean, Alexandra's here, Bucky's other grandchild, and Lucilla, Bucky's niece. Like, so we have, you know, quite we're honored with quite a collection of family members here to discuss this rather personal portrait of experiences that led to many of Fuller's ideas. So with that, I'd love, Jaime, to hand you the baton if you want to introduce some of the reasons why the estate is republishing this book and the significance of the sense of significance.
Well, I think the book is, I actually had some correspondence with the Morley family. Christopher Morley was, as I assume you probably, most of you have picked up, and because you're erudite and looking at these things, but Christopher Morley was a rather major creative force in the 20th century literature in New York City, and through a series of synchronicities, you could say, their lives came together. And what I think is so remarkable about this book is that it really, more than any other book that I've seen in Bucky literature, it really gives you a very intimate and sort of inside experience of Bucky and his life and the evolution of it, as opposed to sort of a outside with all the events and the things he did and the things that a lot of people are familiar with. I think so. Chris, my own contention is that Christopher Morley was really Bucky's mentor, and in some ways, really the unique and single mentor of Bucky. I mean, to kind of fill that out a little bit, Lucilla's published a book on Jim Hardy. Jim Hardy was a boatsman, a seaman, a fellow who ran Bear Island when the family bought the island in 1904. And Jim was a major influence on Bucky because basically, Jim was somebody who knew how to do things, fix things, build things. There was nobody out on the island to run engines and build tools and raise sheep and basically make everything work, because there's a lot of logistics when you're 12 miles off the coast. So that was a major force for Bucky. And haven't yet had a chance to read Lucilla's book, which I'm looking forward to. And then, a lot of us are familiar with, I think, really another mentor in Bucky's life, who was Bucky's father-in-law, James Monroe Hewlett. And he also was a very big figure in Bucky's life. Together, they went through a lot. They went through the loss of Bucky and Ann's first child at the age of 4 in 1920. And that was, and they and James Monroe Hewlett, I think, was a very important person in the evolution of Bucky's life and work in terms of, again, learning how to do things and build things. And he actually built under James Monroe Hewitt's tutelage. He built a small endeavor, which, as is well chronicled in the book Becoming Bucky Fuller, is quite a story. So both of them were big influences on Bucky, but Chris is really unique in that he really, I guess you could say, the universe brought him together somehow, and it's maybe we'll go into this a little bit further because it's an interesting story about how they came together, but Chris became a person in Bucky's life that really was his older brother, his mentor in the truest sense to the word, and Chris, sort of paralleled and was synchronized with the evolution of Chris's work as an author. And by the way, Chris was also the one of the founders of the Saturday Review, and was also an editor of Bartlett's books, etc. So he was a pretty big figure. In any event, the Chris, I think, unlike, as I say, uniquely, really kind of guided Bucky through, and we can talk more about that cycle a little bit. But basically, the basic timeline is that right after Bucky's first daughter Alexandra passed on at the age of 4, Chris happened to stumble on a beautiful piece that Chris had written, a poem called To a Child, and it really touched Bucky very deeply, as one can only imagine what somebody who's lost a daughter can go through. But and then a number of years later, when Bucky was kind of starting his Dymaxion work and he wrote the 4D, then he eventually wrote Chris a letter and sending him 4D, but never got a reply, though it was later recorded in the archive of Christopher Morley's archive that he had indeed received the letter. And then in 1934, they had known each other in 1934, he happened to intersect through Christopher Morley's older brother, I believe it was, to intersect around the Dymaxion car and a meeting they had, and they became, once they met each other, they became very intimate friends, and really began a remarkable lifelong journey that really spanned the arc. It really embraced the whole arc of Bucky's creative work in a certain sense, or a core. Bucky, all of the work he did, obviously starting, Chris really made 9 Chains to the Moon happen. He introduced, I think he really encouraged Bucky to write, and introduced Bucky to Lippincott Publishers. And so it's a remarkable story, and there's so much more detail to it. But I think if it is such an intimate experience of Bucky as a human being, and the joys of his friendship with Christopher Morley, and the remarkable wisdom. Chris is a remarkable writer. I'm only beginning to read him, but in this book, there's so many just profound articulations of his perspectives of the world and life and who we are in that world. And so in any event, I think I'll kind of pause there, but that sets up the frame and why I think this book is so important, because, you know, so many of the other books that are out there are just, you know, they're kind of looking from the outside in, and this book is really looking from the inside out, and in a way that is quite rich and paints a very different picture.
I was wondering, speaking of experience, if it might not be worth actually reading to a child, since that's really the genesis of the story. And it was reading that Bucky claimed, you know, was the beginning of their friendship, even though it was long before they met in person. And he'd memorized this and recited it for Chris. What was it, 12 years after he read it or something? That it was that significant. And Chris had written it the same year that Alexandra died, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well, Chris, yes, that's right. Chris, that's Bucky saw it. It was like literally days after the passing of Alexandra that Bucky happened to read in the, I forget what column, one of Chris's columns. He read this beautiful poem, and it touched Bucky. You know, this was 1920, and stayed with Bucky for many, many years. It wasn't until 14 years later that he actually met Chris. And but that always stayed with him. But David, you want to read it?
Sure, you could. I could. I'm happy to.
Go for it.
Like it. Yeah, I've got it pulled up here. Okay, to a child. The greatest poem ever known is one all poets have outgrown, the poetry innate untold of being only 4 years old, still young enough to be a part of nature's great impulsive heart, born comrade of bird, beast, and tree, all unself-conscious as the bee. And yet with lovely reason skilled, each day new paradise to build, the late explorer of each sense, without dismay, without pretense. In your unstained, transparent eyes, there is no conscience, no surprise. Life's queer conundrums you accept, your strange divinity still kept. Being that now absorbs you all, harmonious, unit, integral, will shred into perplexing bits. Oh, contradictions of the wits. And life that sets all things in rhyme may make you poet too in time. But there were days, O tender elf, when you were poetry itself.
Yeah.
I can imagine, yeah, reading that in the state that that he was in, and why that would have such a profound effect. And I think that set the stage, that this book traces rather remarkably of their own attunement, you know, like the intuitive sense. In reading the book, I was struck, even if I was taking notes, I found myself having to kind of color code, because it was going back and forth between a lot of their own resonances with intuition and the poetic sensibility for understanding key principles and ideas and ways of being, as well as their own attunement to kind of scientific discovery and staying up to speed on a lot of, you know, the ways in which science itself understands things through, you know, the process, purportedly through, you know, more rational modalities of thought, but their resonances really seem to be of, you know, ways of understanding the totality with the totality of the capacity of intuition, of logic, of poetry, and Christopher's own writings around that. In some ways are brutal. It was kind of like the poet never achieves what the scientist can like finalize. The poet's always pursuing. It's never complete. and in many ways, the way that he's narrating that is pointing to the difficulties of approaching life in such an open-ended way that you're trying to take into account like all of your capacities and to integrate them in particular ways. And I think that that's something that was really striking me in reading this, because that's very much what Bucky came around to, discussing in many of his texts, and I think that oftentimes when people first encounter him, they're not aware of the degree to which poetry was such a major influence on and product of his own work. I rarely encounter folks that have read Intuition and some of his other books that are approaching things with his particular form of ventilated prose. And I was wondering, as you were reading through this, what was striking you with regards to sort of insights into the history and the influence that Christopher had on Bucky, that over time blossomed into kind of how he was thinking and communicating about a lot of his own insights and discoveries around the generalized principles?
Well, it's interesting. I look at I look at the evolution of Bucky, and I see those pictures taken of Bucky in the 20s, and he was pretty, he had been through quite a bit. And by the way, a footnote to what you were just reading: when 14 years after that piece was written, Bucky actually met Chris. He had memorized that poem and he recited it to Chris upon their first meeting. So, I guess, the arc of Bucky's life, I always sort of, in my interpretation of Bucky's life and work, I see this arc, and I see Chris in it. I see Bucky coming from, all of his interest, being in machinery and buildings and tools and getting into the stockade building system and building things and doing things, and then inventing the Dymaxion house and all of these profound things. But I think when he met Chris, he, somewhere in there's a description of the Bucky next to Chris in their personalities, and it says that Bucky and his, Chris was so outgoing and so articulate and filled the room, and Bucky was very demure and quiet, and it didn't say a lot unless you were very interested to hear what he had to say. But I think, Chris, in my observation and interpretation of this arc, is that Chris was the person who really said to Bucky, you have something to say. Don't identify yourself as just a builder and building the next invention. What you have a great experience. You have a great experience to share, and it's important that you articulate yourself and express yourself, which isn't surprising from Chris, who was a gifted writer, but he saw that in Bucky and really encouraged Bucky to write, to the degree that, he actually lined up a contract for Bucky to do 9 Chains to the Moon, which was quite a leap from stockade building. So I'd say that's one important piece of the puzzle.
When we were talking earlier, you kind of referenced it, referred to the book as a Rosetta Stone to Fuller's work, which I thought was a really interesting, way into it, particularly just because the nature of even how it's written, how it's going back and forth. And I find that when I'm going back and forth with reading Fuller's writings, that oftentimes when he's doing sort of historical recounting, I find myself wanting to go back to some of the ventilated prose and kind of be in the flow with the thinking that somehow feels like even a more direct, transmission of sorts that's requiring a deeper attunement to the intuitive. But in this book, I found it really interesting how attuned they both were to a lot of the scientific discoveries that were unfolding at the time, as well as global geopolitics. Like there's a lot of history woven into like even Christopher's perspective on World War I and then World War II, and there was this larger context and backdrop against which their friendship was unfolding, which I found to be like really fascinating, right? Especially sort of considering the times we're in now, how they were making sense of what was going on then geopolitically. Do you have any thoughts on sort of what Christopher's presence meant for Bucky as far as his own evolution of his own thinking? Because he was going through so much at the time with regards to the experiments with the car and with building structures and getting involved with thinking about efficiency of materials, with troops returning, from World War II, kind of spanning decades here. But I'm just wondering if there were anything that in the text that you feel from the Rosetta Stone perspective, what are some of the things that you think we can draw on that were influencing Bucky's thinking around some of those like larger, planetary issues that he was learning from Chris?
Well, I mean, again, I keep seeing this arc, and I see that Bucky was so, he was coming out of these structures, and that was sort of leading somewhere, and he's building a car, and then somewhere right in all of that, it's amazing work. At the same time, it's sort of up and down, and things, experiments and etc. But in that arc, he meets Chris, who basically, Nine Chains of the Moon is quite a book. It's quite amazing kind of languaging. And I often think of great teachers who are often see things in pupils that the pupils don't see themselves. And I feels like, from reading this book, this arc, and also just watching the evolution of their language and their correspondence, that was a major part. I think we could have an interesting conversation about, many people often, over the years, Allegra would say, well, in Allegra's mind, Bucky was really a teacher. Sometimes I have said, and think, well, Bucky, in essence, was really a sailor, navigator. And, in some ways, Chris comes into the mix, and all of a sudden there's this really powerful force of poetry and literature. The books that he's quoting and citing just kind of along the way are so, there's, he read everything in the universe, and so I think that was, and when I look at the arc of Bucky's work that comes then, he still keeps going with this ephemeral side of his geometry, which is sort of another interesting, from the words to the geometry. It also, it basically kind of sets the stage for a part, when Bucky, in the final, the sort of final stage of Bucky's life, once the dome is birthed, and this book ends sort of right when the first dome is actually being built on Mount Washington, that last phase of Bucky's life was so much about writing and speaking and ideas and thinking and conceptioning and being able to articulate that. And I think that was, I mean, a lot of that, it just was sort of infused just by their relationship and its intimacy.
And I was also struck sort of by their respective views on technology. I mean, like how one interprets the nature of Fuller's essence as sailor, navigator, educator. And one of my favorite quotes of his, since energetics has to do with paraphrasing, but the universe is technology, right? That we naively call nature, right? That it's they got this complex integrity that he was constantly trying to discern. And in the book, he's quoted as saying, I had the responsibility of knowing that the universe is nothing but technology. So he was taking a particular view of his own responsibility for discerning the structures and the principles underlying that technology. And at the same time, Chris had written a piece called Mind Erosion, in which he said, the magnificent achievements of science have also raised up devils to plague us, principalities and powers we have not learned how to control. I mention only one of such terrific scope that it reaches from zenith to pit and is efficient in both regions, the great life-giving and destroying angel publicity. People can be killed with photographs as surely as guns. The arts are encouraged by reasonable publicity, but they need privacy too. It was almost like Chris's attunement to this like constant questioning of the social and the dynamics of the social was at some level like seeking out the principles similar to what Bucky was doing with kind of cosmic principles, like he was always sort of inquiring into the dangers unleashed within social dynamics that weren't actually necessarily conscious of their own destructive powers, right? Which I don't know, to me, that's a really interesting parallel with how Fuller was anticipating mass manufacturing processes and the destructive nature of extraction and the consequences of colonial capitalism and its pardoning of mass resource extraction without tending to the integrity of relationships over time. It's almost like Chris was doing the same sort of things, but in a social sense. And that there was some dance going on there in terms of how Bucky was learning from him about how, or maybe learning and also probably just like finding resonances with him that seemed really important, which both, I think it kind of came together in some ways in the way that they both wrote about God, right? Yeah. which is very nuanced. I mean, and I think that's even now, I think there's some contemporary critiques of Bucky that are just kind of dismissive because he was writing about God that actually completely fails to acknowledge the context of the degree to which they were both looking at life as God and the capacity to discern principles as God, and it was a completely sort of non-anthropomorphic notion of these ineffable powers that were in many ways approaching it in ultimately the most agnostic ways, realizing the inability to describe these things. It seems like those aspects of their interest in these underlying concepts and weaving together principles that they were discerning and exploring intuitively is what brought them together so much. Like I forget the name of the river that they what is it?
I don't know how it's pronounced. Monosuc. Is that the one you mean?
Yeah. It's not
Ammonoosuc.
part of the.
What is it?
Yeah, thank you.
Ammonoosuc.
Ammonoosuc. I've been trying to figure that out for months.
But there's a particular, which is a indigenous place name for the river, but there's a particular passage where they go there and they're just kind of like ecstatic, celebrating the nature of the river and the place, and it seems like their connection really was woven with their deep appreciation for the fundamental integrity of these living systems. And really like trying to discern like what was their responsibility for bringing forth that beauty and that integrity, and and ultimately what they would channel as God, right? Which is, I think, in many ways very I don't know, some of the writings recently that are like critiquing Fuller that it really doesn't do service to what he and Chris were trying to bring forth in terms of appreciation and love of those types of living systems.
Yeah,
that's not a question so much. I'm thinking about that, such a deep intimacy with their appreciation for that, and that seemed to be in large part the sense of significance they were drawing on.
Yeah. There's so many stories. I'm kind of inspired. You mentioned that. I'm kind of looking for this account. Oh well, I'll get to it. There's so many wonderful things just to look at in terms of just their expression. I mean, I was sort of amazed at some of the. Here's an interesting one that I had stumbled on. It's from a piece called Epistle to the Colossians. And it's an essay he wrote called Mind Erosion. And he said, now the concern that occupies my own mind is that never anywhere at any time was secluded creative thinking so difficult to achieve as in America today. Every human being is endowed with a limited, this sounds like a little bit of Bucky, so you see this, that this is Chris. Every human being is endowed with a limited and infinitely precious stock of attention power. And life today is such that unless the individual is singularly obstinate and cunning, the native and tender innocence of the mind, the artist's birthright, is dissipated or conventionalized by endless, incessant, competitive demands, by newspapers, by electric lights, by telephone, by radio, by moving pictures, by airplane and motor car, church and school and state, by 1,000 appeals, admonitions and interruptions. The mind is assailed and distracted. When the time comes to throw the whole power of one's will into some superb task, too often we find our faculties grown brittle or callous by repeated overstimulus. We hear a good deal about the agricultural problems of soil erosion. Surely not less serious is the matter of mind erosion. The dust storms of daily excitement and triviality can easily blow away the sensitive topsoil of the spirit.
Wow.
Wow.
Hard to imagine something more timely. Oh man. Yeah. That's the same essay. That was the same one that I was reading from earlier, about publicity, right?
Yeah. It's so much in there.
Yeah.
But one thing, the book is also, there's so much more to kind of to all this than we can cover in a short meeting. But there's the wonderful delight and their joy and their friendship. There's a chapter in the book called Expectation Season, and that's when I think 9 Chains to the Moon is it's done, but it's sort of waiting at the press. And they basically, I think, Anne and Allegra and are off with the family somewhere, and they go up to this. How do you say it, Alexander?
Ammonoosuc.
Yeah. They go up and they spend, they just like take off in the car and they drive up to the country. Where is that in? Is that in Maine?
Hampshire? Northern New Hampshire.
And they just drive off to the country and they're just in ecstasy, spend a weekend in ecstasy, reading and writing and delighting. And it's, and then there's all these different layers about all these funny, just these funny things like the number 22 for him and which became really big. And I'm not sure, maybe some of you on the call know of his foundations in numerology, but he was very into numerology and was the number 22 became so significant. And so, they would, on 22 days, they would, if they weren't together, they would like telegraph each other, or they'd go on adventures together or whatever it might be. And there were just so many, there was also every time they crossed the Mississippi, that was somehow a big event in their lives that they would mark. And also a lot of things that seemed, and I got to tell you one story, just because I was mentioning to David the other day. Bucky the sailor, and this just shows this kind of side. Bucky was, we were sailing on the New York Yacht Club cruise back on the Intuition when
his boat.
Yeah, the Intuition, the sailboat that he had gotten in 1968. And there was we sailed on the New York Yacht Club cruise, which is basically a week of about 100 yachts off the coast of New England, sailing from one port to the other, and they race. And so they have races each day. And then you land in the next port and you anchor, and then you go to the local yacht club and have parties and et cetera. So we were, I think, in Woods Hole. We had landed from Newport, I think, to Woods Hole, and we were anchored. And being a racing event, you don't have a little dinghy to take you into the yacht club. All the big boats are at anchor, so you've got a little launch that takes you out. So we were all sitting on the launch, sitting on the float, waiting for the launch to take us into the yacht club. And we're sitting there on this platform, that floating platform, and all of a sudden, Bucky says, "Oh my God." And he kind of looks at the guy next to him, one of the other skippers. They're all wearing their blue yacht club blazers, etc. And he turns to Bucky. Bucky turns to the guy and says, "Look, no. And he starts to almost wrestle with Bucky on the dock. He's trying to show him something. And the guy thinks he's crazy a little bit. And he finally turns him, and what he's doing is he's trying for Bucky to see the new moon for the first time in its cycle, but see it over his left shoulder, which is apparently good luck." So, Chris and Bucky and 22s and crossing the Mississippi and looking over the left shoulder, and all these, all these dynamics are somehow integral with this sense of significance. I think that's that title. We should read it together, but it's a very powerful thought about the mystery of life and the richness of life and the sacredness of life, etc.
Thank you for that, Jamie. I just wanted to, for anybody that probably doesn't need to be said with this audience, but you've mentioned Allegra and Anne, just for anybody that might not know, not on a first name basis, Allegra was Bucky's daughter and Anne was his wife and Jamie's mother and grandmother. So just some context for some of the stories. We have flown through this hour and I wanted to make sure that we left some space for any discussion or comments or questions or anything from folks that have joined us.
That'd be great. Can I just, I want to just read one quick thing to preface that so you can think about what you maybe want to say. This is where the actual, this is what Chris wrote, where the term sense of significance comes from. And this was in an essay Chris wrote in 1926 called The Romney Stain. He says, one can only fall back on the instinctive sense of significance, that subtle and massive intuition that must be, for every type of creator, I suppose, the captain of his 7 deadly senses. The sense of significance, yes, that occult and instantaneous decision that certain gestures, certain random incidents are necessary parts of the composition of our world. This instinct is capricious and quick. Often one is puzzled to know why such petty observations come full meaning, magically confluent with the dark undercurrent of the mind.
I like the follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Which Bucky wrote in 1976 about that. Here, Chris was identifying the complex integral with which I am preoccupied and identify as synergetics. Mutual sense of significance continually re-inspired our friendship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So much love. You know, that's, I guess, ultimately, you know, best of friends. Deep.
Well, we'll love to hear from anyone. I don't know, some of you have probably read the book since it's been out for a number of years. Hey, we have a hand up from Doug Jacobs. Hey, Doug.
Hi. I just had a short comment. When I was researching the play, I ran into a lot about Christopher Morley, and there were certain things.
You want to tell us what the play is for anybody that might not know?
Yeah, R. Buckminster Fuller, The History and Mystery of the Universe. And there was a lot, and I wanted to put a lot about Christopher Morley in the play, but it would have been a different play. It would have been a play of its own almost, you know, or a road movie, a buddy movie or something. And so I ended up cutting out all of that material about him, except for 2 lines, which are from To a Child. And so it's in the section of the play that's about the new child, which is about the birth of Allegra after the death of Alexandra. And he says, I will dedicate myself to the new young life. And the end of that section ends with the quote, and yet with lovely reason skilled, each day new paradise to build, which was kind of Bucky's through line in a way, was to build a new paradise so that children wouldn't live in and families wouldn't suffer as much as they did. So I was able to preserve 2 lines of Christopher Morley in the play, but because it was such an important relationship. But and I love road trips, and so that idea that they had these road trips were, you know, terrific.
Yeah, there's funny escapades. You know, there's some of them they're doing like mutual publicity things where Bucky's driving the Damaxian car, and Chris has just launched his new book, or vice versa. Bucky's just about launching 9 Chains to the Moon, and Chris is doing some event, and they're on a train stop in the Midwest, and you know, it was just kind of a whole different world of so many wonderful stories and enjoying of life, and yeah, it's an inspiration, I think, for difficult times.
Mm-hmm.
Quite. George, you had a comment?
Yes, I was touched by the love and tenderness in the way they communicated. Every step of the way, you could just hear the kindness and care in their friendship, and it was really beautiful. And, Bucky saying, love is metaphysical gravity, and how love is important to creativity, that sense of safety and the lack of judgment, of allowing judgment in and accepting your place in the universe. And they just lived it. And it was really nice to see that in their correspondence. So thank you.
It's interesting, really, that this whole arc, their friendship, is sort of synchronized with, hard to put a word on it, but it's just somehow it fulfilled itself. Chris passed on just a few years after the dome was patented and the dome started coming out, and Bucky was there, and there was the last little bit of trickles of communication between the two of them. Just so Chris was aware that the dome was up on wherever it was, out Washington, I think. And so it's just kind of this natural system, it's like the universe wove these two men together at a moment in history that was very synergetic and very much enhanced each of their lives and enriched their work, and sort of almost ultimately, in a way, passed the baton, kind of, in a certain sense. Very touching. I'm in my fourth reading of it.
Wow.
Kurt Prisbilla.
I just wanted to say, Allegra gave me a copy of this book quite a while ago, and it's been a while since I read it, but something that jumped out, and you alluded to it, Jamie, was the numerology and the number 22 and its significance to them. And it's mentioned early on in the book how Allegra's name in numerology adds up. Allegra Fuller adds up to 22 in numerology as well. So there was some significance of that. And it had personal significance for me because some friends and I had a thing for 11 and actually 1111. So that added up. And I've always noted and often make the point of bringing it up in workshops that I do, that in synergetics, the only chapter that survives in ventilated prose or verse is the last one, which is numerology. And Bucky goes into his ideas about numerology there. So that connection with the number 22 came out in this book in a way that was significant for me. But you can see it was very it was a connection for them as well, and certainly their road trips and friendship come out there. And I believe it was on one of those road trips when they were going through a cornfield that the idea of the Demaxian deployment unit making something from a silo came up as well. So it was a really fun and significant read, and to see their friendship was quite moving.
Yeah, well said.
Here's a numerological note for you on the screen, Kurt. With the 11s.
That's Bucky's note to Chris.
Yeah, and they mention, I think, in the book that 22 is the highest number in numerology because it is 11 times 2. So, and also making the note that Christopher Morley got into the numerology through Bucky, but then started really checking out words, and he utilized it in I think his novel Trojan Horse, like that the Greeks had the numbers right.
Fun pictures.
We're getting to the top of the hour. I'm just kind of scrolling through some of the plates in the book, which are so fun to read about. It does give just a profound insight into like some of this early thinking that I think is, even though, you know, the Stanford archives reveal quite a bit about one man's life and the life of his vast networks. This book in particular, I think, is, like you said, it's a Rosetta Stone for so much of the thinking that is, you know, still, I think, unfolding and evolving in so many ways.
Yeah, it's like being from the inside out. Where I was thinking of my father, the filmmaker Robert, had a thing that he used to talk about his films, because as his films on many of the great creative people, hold that one for a sec, David, the creative people that he did films of, he eventually evolved into not having narration on them. And as I talked to him about it and others talked to him about it, he made a distinction in his way. He said it's itness, not aboutness. Itness, you know, it's the actual experience of Bucky, not the mental interpretation of Bucky by, you know, a narrator. And I feel like this wonderful book is itness. I mean, we get to sort of live, you know, we get a little glimpse of this era in these two men's lives and their friendship and their ups and downs and their wonders and their articulations and their inspirations and their this picture is shifting anyway. So, but this picture, I just learned to interpret this because my brother-in-law Sam filled me in. This says to the OM, and OM in this picture means old man. That was kind of one of Chris's many sort of writing names, that he was Old Mandarin. It's short for that. And it says, an inchoate, intuit, into a co-to-it, the world is nay oyster to half shell or stew it. Now, I just learned, and maybe all of you or many of you may know, but Sam said a co-to-it is a very delectable oyster in the New England. And so the reference there, with this wonderful play of words, is come to a deeper level of meaning for me. And this is, I think, the last communication.
Well, I think that's the perfect place to end. Cosmic scribblings on a doily. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It's been quite a delight. And thank you, Jaime, for helping us to unpack this a little bit. And thank you for taking on making this available, getting the ebook out there.
That's fun. We really wanted to get that out before kind of doing this event, and it worked out. So I'm glad that it's now out on the platforms. So yeah.
And I think we linked to it from the event page on the BFI website, but and also in the newsletters from BFI. So yeah. And so just a reminder, Space Camp coming up for those of you who joined late. I'll put that in the chat again as we close out. And if you're not already a member of BFI, please join us. And I mentioned to David and Jamie at the top of the call, if you have event ideas, you're welcome to let us know for members in particular, but also for the larger community. And I am Felicia at bfi.org. And you can always also send an email to contact@bfi.org. So thanks for joining us, everybody.
Yes, thank you all. Really a great pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Then I can see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful.
Second. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Jamie.
much.
Judith.